All right, everyone, let's get the show started. Welcome to our DevOps office hours. It's March 9th, 2022. My name is Eric Osterman, and I'll be leading the conversation. I'm the founder and CEO of Cloud Posse. We're a DevOps accelerator, and that means that we help companies own their infrastructure in record time by building it together with your team while showing them the ropes. So if that sounds interesting, head over to cloudposse.com/quiz to get started. Again, that's cloudposse.com/quiz to get started. For those of you new to the call, the format is very informal. My goal is to get your questions answered. So feel free to unmute yourself at any time if you want to jump in and participate. If you're tuning in from our podcast or YouTube channel, you can register for these live and interactive sessions by going to cloudposse.com/office hours. Again, that's cloudposse.com/office hours. We host these calls every week. Our call today is recorded. We'll automatically post a recording of this session to our YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up on back episodes and support our channel, please head over to youtube.com/cloudposse and hit those like and subscribe buttons. So with that said, let's jump into some announcements. Kind of light announcements for this week, but the first one that caught my eye is interesting. It's not really a CVE of any kind, and it seems more just like a gaffe in documentation that's not well enough known. I admit I didn't know about it, but while the headline here is Google WAF bypassed by oversized post requests, it turns out that really it's both Amazon's Web Services WAF as well as Google's WAF has this same 8K limit. And apparently it's documented in both providers' documentation, but it's not really understood. And what that means is basically when you want to commence that, when you're writing your next bot network and you want to commence that DOS attack, just make sure that your payload is over 8K so you can properly bypass those WAFs. So you heard it here first, joking. All right, next announcement is more in support of Ukraine. Amazon Web Services come out and has decided to block additional signups from Russia and Belarus, who have been supporting, obviously, the tragic war against Ukraine. So I think it's just phenomenal to see the outreach and support from all the companies doing what they can to make this a very unpopular war. So I feel horrible for everyone on both sides of this conflict that didn't want to see war. This one's interesting. A number of our customers are using GitLab. There are a slew of CVEs that have just been addressed or fixed in these fixes here. I'm curious, like, what the backstory is. Did they just go through a pen test, or was there a white hat hacker out there that just came out with all these vulnerabilities? I think the main concerns are that unprivileged users had a way to add other users to groups through the API, which sounds pretty bad to me, and the ability to leak environment variables through email delivery, among other things. So make sure you've upgraded your GitLab. Another announcement is something we've talked about before, that GitHub Actions officially supports private actions, but it wasn't GA. So this is just an announcement that now this is GA. It should be enabled in your GitHub Enterprise cloud account. And to enable it, I thought it was kind of interesting how it works, is that you need to basically designate the repo as being accessible in the organization from other repositories. Has anyone already kicked the tires on the private actions in your enterprise? I am bummed that these things are only enterprise. And lastly, did you guys ever hear me say, take the Cloud Posse quiz? Because if you haven't, take the Cloud Posse quiz if you want to see what it's like working with Cloud Posse. it's just a few questions to understand kind of where you're at, what stage you're at, and see if we're a good fit and if we can help you out. We only work with customers who are a good fit and we feel like we can move the needle for. So go to cloudposse.com/quiz and check it out. Okay, Q&A. So Carrie, our trusted assistant here, has been helping put the notes together. So this is really good. Here are some questions that have come up through Slack over the past week or in the Office Hours channel. One that I'm really interested also relates to GitHub Enterprise. Mohaha is asking if there's a better way to serve private pages in on GitHub or through GitHub or GitLab, because the ability to have private repos is fenced behind GitHub Enterprise. So it's really nice if you are in GitHub Enterprise, you can just enable it, and it uses GitHub's single sign-on to access those private pages. For everyone else, you're left with Netlify or Cloudflare pages, some complicated contrived implementation using Lambdas and CloudFront and S3 and all that jazz. So what is everyone doing? Has anyone solved this in a simple way? Like, we want to deploy a simple static site without.
I did something in this domain in the past and I found what was really good for if you're on GCP, if you use Cloud Identity Proxy, that's a great way to put a like an authentication wall in front of any kind of unauthenticated app.
And with the authentication, like, how would you expose then GitHub page? For example, if you had a static site on GitHub in a private repo, you still wouldn't have any way of really. You could obfuscate the origin, but you
publish somewhere.
Yeah. And with S3, could with the identity proxy, can you pass additional headers for authentication so that, like, if you're making requests to an S3 bucket, you can use a policy to check the headers for a pre-shared key?
That's actually a really good point. Like that's definitely cross-cloud kind of interesting stuff. I wonder if Amazon has like native though. I think budget is supposed to something.
Yeah. I'm surprised that Amazon doesn't have a proxy solution like that today.
I mean, the nice part is with GCP, it just plugs right into your Google Workspace, which you're probably using.
Yeah.
That's the real benefit there.
What I mean, yeah, there really isn't. I mean, ALBs support OIDC, but kind of defeats the purpose of deploying this ALB and having a static site on S3. Like, do we really need it?
Yeah, ALB is usually, it can also be pretty debatably easy integrated with SSO, but Amplify Hosting, which is AWS's alternative for Netlify, does support passwords.
Passwords, but not OIDC or anything.
No, let's not get overboard here. Just passwords. That's enough. I posted the link in the Zoom and the Slack channel.
Okay.
It works. It's fine. I'm using it for my blog for preview things. It asks for a password. It's fine. It works. It's valid. It's simple. It's there. It's not as polished as Netlify or Versal or all the other tools, but it's there and it's easy.
Okay.
You have to admit, it's a little bit like a modern cloud htaccess file.
It is. That is all it is. It's that. It's your HT pass WD.
Am I crazy? But doesn't GitHub Pages now support private visibility
for enterprise?
It's only enterprise. I thought everyone does that.
No, not unless there was yet another announcement that, hey, we were wrong, and we made it accessible to everyone. But I haven't seen that announcement. The great thing is that GitHub has been finally innovating over the last couple of years and releasing tons of features. The bad thing is all those features are going into enterprise, or many of them are going to enterprise. All right. So yeah, any other, let's see in the chat here. Oh, okay, you shared it. I'll post this also in the thread here. Charles is asking a question, would it be possible somehow to leverage Amazon Cognito to provide this functionality? I bet there might be some roundabout way of doing it, but Cognito is not exactly lightweight. And we were reading between the lines, we were looking for a really lightweight solution. Like, God, this would just be solved if we could enable that feature flag on the GitHub repo, and then we have the static site with OIDC, or at least with GitHub single sign-on. That would be easy. And for those of you who haven't seen this site, I love it. sso.tax. So let's see here, GitHub. So yeah, if you want to go enterprise, your bill is going to go up by 425%. So that's a lot to pay for just private pages, if that was the only thing you needed. Welcome to SaaS. And I felt this from very recently.
I think there's also user minimum. I remember I had to do some enterprise tests and I had to create an organization.
Oh, there's probably a user
That
minimum
was
too on top of that.
expensive.
Yeah, I think it's 50 users is the minimum. Yeah.
Oh, I hate it. I hate it. I really I just want to use your product. I love it. I'm sorry, I'm a smaller company. Can you just make it accessible? These are, I understand why you're targeting enterprises, but I could really become an enterprise if you gave me these features. So please give me these features and we'll figure out the other part. That's my end of my rant. All right. Another good topic for debate. I'd love to open it up to everyone here. It's come up before. Comes up every now and then. To remote state or not to remote state, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in terraformers' minds to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against the sea of troubles. So the issue here is remote state is a great tool or mechanism to access outputs from other modules that you have in your infrastructure. Remote state is a way of Terraform basically reading the state of any other one of your Terraform root modules that you've provisioned. And the problem is the problem happens that you want to use remote state when you start breaking your infrastructure into smaller pieces, because if you had all your infrastructure just in one state, it would be very easy in Terraform just to access the internal variables or resources or locals that you needed to. But as we've learned over time that these Terraform monoliths are a pretty bad pattern because your blast radius is massive, making any change, and they can sometimes just be prohibitively slow to run. I mean, hours and hours just to plan, not to mention apply. So we break our infrastructure down into these smaller components, and then we have a new problem. Well, we could copy and paste the hard-coded settings, like the VPC ID or the subnet CIDRs or these things. But nobody likes to do that. It's error prone and it's not dry. So we have a couple options then, right? We can use remote state and get the outputs from that other component that provisioned your VPC. We can maybe use a data source to query some tags to find that information. We could stash it in SSM, or we can hard code it. Those are really our options. And there's a debate internally. There are two tribes, basically. The one tribe says use data sources for everything you can. Technically, remote state is a data source, but let's just pretend it's not, or like in a different class by itself. And then there's the camp that says use the VPC data source to find the VPC via tags. So let's open it up. Pros and cons. Is there a black and white rule here that you guys follow?
I think you're always going to end up having to pull a remote state at some point because there just isn't going to be a data source for some bit of information that you need. Exactly. And in that vein, it's like you kind of I think, what I usually advise clients are like, the fellow team members that are on my clients' teams is like, hey, let's use data sources wherever we can so that we don't create a dependency when it's easy. Like data sources for, not the remote state data source, but data sources to pull any information that's easy to pull. But then beyond that, when you need to use remote state, just use remote state, and you kind of deal with, you're creating a contract between those two root modules. You're creating a dependent relationship. And
that's a good point.
For anybody who's in this, game, it's those dependent relationships suck because, you then need to rerun, you update A, and if B is dependent on A, you then need to run B because that output changed, and Terraform doesn't really give us a good way to orchestrate that. I think we all have our hacks around doing it. I still, what Atmos does, or maybe not Atmos, but what the space lift automation module does is, it's a start, it's a way of doing it, but it doesn't. Yeah. It's not, the ultimate. Yeah.
Playing devil's advocate then a little bit is then, okay, so we agree that, not every data source for cloud APIs will return the information you need in the shape you need it, given the filters that you need to pass it. Sometimes it's just not that flexible. And given that, okay, maybe it's horrible, let's pretend to use Terraform's remote state. Why don't we just standardize on SSM? Just stick everything in SSM. We have a standardized key value store for everything that we need, and it's interoperable with other frameworks, whether you're using Pulumi or whether you're using, some scripting or something.
So I have a couple thoughts. First of all, I think the original question was, is there a right way to do it? And frankly, I don't think that there's a such thing as a right way to do it when you have so many different companies and so many different engineers. The right way is going to be whatever works within the shop. Secondly, I think it's always going to be a matter of trying to find the right source of truth. That could be multiple sources, but as long as those sources are the top of the tippy triangle of whatever the source of that truth is, that's what you need to do. And then as far as using SSM, the only problem I see with using SSM is that, and again, this is all subjective, but it totally depends on your shop. Do you want to tie yourself into Amazon, or do you want to create your own method of storing key value pairs somewhere or whatever? I don't think that the source, as it were, is really the issue. It's more about what you think your source of truth is and how you make that available to your services.
That's a good point, that a good nuance there. Like, well, SSM first of all is a very AWS centric solution, and not everyone uses AWS. So there, I think that's a good characteristic. Mohammed?
Yeah, actually, hi everyone. I support what Matt says. I've been there, I guess. And I prefer data source over remote state because data source is doing like in plan time validation. And there is a use case when you, for example, deploy something with a VPC, like a VPC stack, and then you're gonna a query using remote state data source, like let's say a subnet ID, right? But let's say someone deleted that subnet ID, and then you're gonna query an old or non-exist ID. But if you use data source for query that the same subnet ID, that's gonna fail because it's not there. But if you use the remote state, it will not appear, and you will not catch the error earlier. And also for SSM, I guess some frameworks, like when you combine serverless with Terraform, you need like a middleware between the two stacks, right? Between Terraform and serverless. So I guess, like Jim said, there is no ultimate solution here, but I guess data sources, for me at least, is I prefer it over remote states. Yeah.
All right.
I agree with everybody here. I do prefer data sources over remote state. It goes data source first. If that's not possible, SSM, and in extreme cases, maybe remote state. But the original question was about it being annoying to send a bunch of variables. Yes, do that. It's fine. Yes, you're gonna have to send the VPC ID down through 50 different modules, and all of them are gonna have to have a variable named VPC ID. That's fine, and that duplication is way better than using a data source to discover the VPC ID. It's clear to the user. It's an extra line and a couple lines to define the variable and description and stuff. But that's better. Have
Yeah.
expected inputs and outputs to modules. Don't hide any surprises or complicated data sources or remote state in modules. Yes, they're verbose, they're annoying, but they're easy and they're easy to understand. And that's a lot more important than having fewer lines of code. Blech.
Yeah, although I think there's definitely a place. So if you think about all of your modules being generic, and then your root module being the composition of your generic modules together for the purpose-built, whatever implementation of those modules, I think that place in the root module is the place that you could use data sources to look it up, et cetera, because you definitely want it to be, you definitely don't want to be passing, like applying a module for the VPC, running the VPC ID, and then manually specifying it as a variable again to that root module, when you can look it up and see that it exists. And when you start getting into the, you have thousands of these possibilities across all of your modules without some sort of lookup function, your code just gets to be completely unreadable, and you don't have the semblance of, like, to me, it's much clearer to say data source, look for the VPC ID where this tag equals this, than it is to see like a raw VPC ID being passed into a root module, because then you're like, where did this come from? How do I know this is the right VPC ID? So I think the context of where you do that is important to remember.
So Sharif, I'm going to get to you in a second. Just want to recap in 2 sentences what Matt said. And I think the distinction here is in your child modules, keep them very generic, not opinionated on where that VPC came from. This is consistent with how the Cloud Posse ecosystem works. And then in your root modules, that's where you can become a little bit more opinionated. And that's where this question is really about. In your root modules, should you be using a remote state? And should you be using like a Terraform state backend or SSM or some other source? And that's where I guess it'll vary a little bit more what you're trying to achieve. And what we are doing, I'll just, as a data point here, Cloud Posse, when we've implemented, okay, it was more than 2 sentences, but when Cloud Posse does this, you'll see like in Terraform, AWS components, what we did is we ended up just implementing a little framework around let's see, around Terraform's remote state. So it's very easy. So in this case, by convention, we create a file called remotestate.tf, and when we want to get the state of the EKS cluster, we can just invoke a module using the remote state. We say what root module we want to get the state for. And then this module now just encapsulate all those outputs, returns them, and it's so easy for us to use remote state. Because I think that's one of the downsides to using Terraform remote state. This is kind of complicated. You got to know what the bucket is. You got to know what the paths in the bucket are. And if you screw that up, you get the wrong data, and that could be catastrophic. So using a framework to abstract it eliminates that problem. All right, Sharif?
Yeah. Sorry, can I just add one quick thing to what Eric said? So it is still complex, even with our simplification. If you need to cross like environment and account boundaries and all of those kinds of things, no matter what, it's complex. So I would definitely try to avoid it when you can, but if you need to, this is the best solution we've come up to. So sorry, Sharif, go ahead.
Yeah, I have 2 points actually. So some other, I'm on the team that uses like the data sources, not remote state. And there's a couple of negative points for remote state, in my opinion. One of it, like it is like a second day, like day 2 operation thing, that when we have a couple of modules that depends on on a module that is the source of this state, and I need to change the state bucket or path. It is like an atomic change. I can't change, like I need to change all the modules that is referencing this source module in the same time when I will move the state. So I don't know if I
or just use a framework that wraps the remote state.
So
you make it.
Yeah, but when the moment I apply the module that is the source of the data,
Yeah.
all others need to be updated on the same time.
Okay.
And
That's a
in
good
my
point.
place,
Yeah.
in my place we have like CICD pipelines, so they will all fail, and they run continuously, so they will all fail because I need to apply it on all the different repos, because it is like it's like the VPC module.
Yeah, you're changing the interface literally.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
with data source, yeah, go on.
I would argue that there's probably something broken in your process if you find that you are frequently moving like state locations inside of your Terraform
It's not
state
frequent, to
backends.
be honest.
Yeah,
It's not frequent, but it happened.
yeah. I mean, sure, it happens sometimes, but it shouldn't
Yeah.
be a frequent occurrence.
Yeah, but when we were using tags, like we were using like consistent tagging and using the data sources to filter with tags, we have like an option to like add the post tags and have like a deprecation phase, so everything is phased out. So it was much better in my experience. The second thing is related to security. So if I have a VPC, which is in my foundational Terraform state, and some applications have their own Terraform state, and they only need the VPC ID or the subnet ID, I need to give them access to the bucket that contains the Terraform
That's a
state.
good point.
Yeah. So using data source, well, I just need to give them read access for, so AWS I don't need to give them the access to the whole bucket, which can contain secrets. I can do passes, like I can do give IAM all by passes, but it will get very complicated. So
yeah, it increases the burden to create good IAM policies to protect all of that. So no, those are really great counter arguments. I think some of the strongest ones brought up so far. I see Jim.
Thanks. It seems like the hands are queuing up.
They are.
One of the things that I wanted to kind of like ask is when I hear people using remote state, I feel as though it's that you got to apply a little bit of Conway's law here. Is like, are we using remote state as like a kind of API boundary between organizations that kind of share responsibilities in a particular domain? And is that really, and this is a guess, I'm not saying that this is like, for those that are using remote state, is that what you're doing? Do you guys share kind of resources that way and need to use remote state as this contractual boundary? And if so, is there a rescoping that can occur that will enable you to not have to have that interface? That's one thing that I would ask. And I'm not supposing that's the case. I'd love to hear a counterexample. But on the other side of that too, like I think that is remote state really the best interface? I guess that's where SSM comes into play, right? And other key value stores and other APIs to disseminate data.
Matt Calhoun, would you have any retort to that or any feedback on that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I actually just started thinking about like what other, key value stores could we use. Obviously you have SSM, as one, but then I started thinking about if like every possible output that could be consumed by something else needed to be stored in SSM, your SSM bill would probably get pretty high pretty quick. On that one too. And you also then have to manage like a reasonable framework of how do you even know where to get the data out of SSM? So that's like, you have to define that API that we were talking about there.
You still need to define
twice.
It,
You need to define it actually twice, right? So you already have an API defined by the module's inputs and outputs, but then you now also need to have another API defined for this is where we store it in, the things that might be needed by other modules. like these are the paths under SSM we store them as. And I haven't seen anyone do a good job of like proposing that or having a standard around that. So that leaves another problem to yet to be defined by the
And they can be
consumer.
overridden and hijacked.
Yeah, and
by
all
the-
sorts of
yeah.
things. And you know, what happens if someone accidentally updates that versus, you know, with a different process, you know, by accident, you know, I don't know. It's fraught.
I want to leave one point, and it's a bit of a counterpoint, and it's a little bit blasphemous, but I think
Don't
but I
use
think
Terraform.
no, it's not. But
Slash
I think
kick. No,
though,
I'm joking.
but I have seen an over reliance on variables sometimes. I think a lot of people think of all the things that could change and just imagine it that it must change and must account for that in the Terraform that they write. I've seen that before, and it's a little maddening sometimes, especially when things are relatively stable.
For proprietary code, I
Yeah.
agree that it doesn't need to be that way. And you have such a luxury. By anybody here not doing open source, just writing Terraform
course.
for your
Yeah.
company, you have such a luxury. You don't know how good you have. And I think that's almost maybe what Terraform was designed for. Because when you start trying to do what we do and just using it in a generic way, you end up having to parameterize the
Absolutely. It's a big difference between a module and a root module. Big difference. But I think in a root module, you can get away with a lot of just expecting the data to be stable. Like the VPC ID, it's gonna be pretty stable. You're not gonna change VPCs every day, right? And if you do, it's gonna be a big thing. So I think in those cases, and you know, there's a certain degree to how many resources that pertains to. But I think for those situations, I personally think it's fine to hard code it, maybe not even look up, you know, and I think that's okay sometimes because it is a manifest language at the root module level.
Yeah, I think managing that becomes the problem, right? Like and not only managing it, but for people reading the code, understanding like what it is you're doing. So VPC ID, I guess, is a pretty clear, like you could go look that up and see what that VPC ID, but like if I see VPC 1234, that's a lot less clear than module.rootState.production VPC, right?
Mhm.
So you know that that's like the production VPC, right? Like that's it's a lot easier for the people like trying to mentally reason about what your code's doing when it's more clear. I mean, it's kind of like why we have variable names versus just like hard coding values everywhere, right?
I agree. You have to that is readability is appropriate, but scoping also comes into play. If you're dealing with one team that's always using the same VPC ID, then eventually they'll actually come to recognize it. And then it's not as important than if you're like a core infrastructure team where you have to like cross-reference all this different stuff.
Right.
So it's different.
So the counter example to this I would give you right now would be, so take it one step further and you're going to build clusters and things like that. And you have 14 subnets within that VPC. And now you just start specifying subnet IDs. No matter how much you use it every day inside and out, you're going to be like, is this the, you know, the persistence subnet in you know, zone A, or is this the public subnet? And so you're going to forget that all the time. So you're going to need some sort of context around that to figure, you know, what it is. So yeah, I don't know that there's a great like one size fits all answer to all this stuff, but I think we can come up with, you know, with counterpoint and counterpoint to almost everything, which is the problem, right? That means that the tool isn't providing us what we need in a conventional manner, which means that we're all free to try to invent our own thing to try to fix it, which you know, I'd much rather see them solve that problem for us somehow. But
Matt Gowie, you've been holding your hand for a while. Wanted to get to you.
Yeah, my only point, and this is like an awesome discussion. I think that, you know, Jim and Matt, you're two going back and forth. Like I can see both sides of that, and it's like it's really good. I lean.
Unfortunately, me too.
Yeah. I lean more towards Matt's thought process, just because, you might only be managing 3, you know, VPCs today because you only have dev stage prod, but then your application team asks, hey, we need, we need PR environments or whatever it is. And then you're dealing with so many more. But anyway, my main point was thinking more about the SSM parameter store idea. I almost, I want to ask Cloud Posse folks, like, why not go that way? And I asked that because I know that there's been like a move away from Chamber, but the idea that API is not just something that could be used by Terraform, but could be used by downstream tooling where, that seems like there's a big benefit in being able to use SSM over remote state, because remote state is just a JSON file in S3, right? That's all we're doing. So you could, hey, curl that S3 file and use JQ to pull out a value and blah, blah, blah. But, if you need to interact and get the VPC ID in some script that is reading all of the, public IP addresses for some security audit or something along those lines, it would be nicer to use SSM as your API that you're interacting with rather than that Terraform backend. So yeah, why did you guys go that way?
I think it was more like an evolution that led to it, where we originally were using so if we go back to like Terraform 0.11 and 0.12, there was still a lot of problems with count of cannot be computed, and I feel like we had almost like the SSM module we have at that time was basically unusable. It was only usable if you wanted to write and then somewhere else read, or somewhere else read and then write, but it just didn't work out. Now we moved over to remote state, therefore in Terraform, and I can't conclusively say that solved it or made it work, but in the end, that's what we're using still today. So I'm guessing that's part of the reason why we are using it. And then Terraform as a language has evolved, and then our tooling and modules around it has evolved to make it easier and easier. I think if I were to revisit it today, I think I might take a stronger look at doing more with SSM. Using like our SSM module, but then addressing what Matt Calhoun said is coming up with the convention for how the paths are, and that it's kind of programmatically enforced and consistent. And who knows, maybe it would work. Also, be advised also that you are limited on the data types in SSM, and you'd have to do serialization and deserialization to do anything really more meaningful, because they are honestly just strings in SSM. Yeah. So you'd still,
yeah, and you'd need to plug that into like every module that does anything. Like instead of just having outputs, you would need to select which subset of those things get stored, right? Too, like it's like double defining your outputs. You have to have
I would do it. I would do it yesterday if we could just access like module.this.outputs, and so we could just proxy all outputs as outputs in Terraform, but also to SSM without having to code it separately. So that we could create kind of a migration layer to facilitate in that move. But since we have so much now in one way, it would be a monumental lift to try and do both.
Yeah. If we really wanted to do something now, the right thing would probably be defining the standard interface and then create a pluggable backend store to it, so that you could use SSM parameter store, you could use DynamoDB.
Yeah, that's true.
You could use Google's version of SSM parameter store if you were doing that, like whatever, like just by writing another implementation of it. That would be the right way to solve it. But
which would be extra cool if you could have providers in a root module that are optional. But you can't. So that's the reason why we wouldn't do that right now. And what would it be called? Like, the Terraform module, Terraform, AWS, GCP, HCP, Azure, parameter store.
Generic parameter store.
Anyway, good answers to that question. I think that that covers the idea for me. I mean, it's a bit of a historical thing, but then there's also You have to create your own interface, and it is more
Yeah.
tedious to populate SSM than it is to just get some outputs.
Which you already got.
Yeah. That makes
Eric
lots
Berg?
of sense.
Eric
Yeah.
Berg, you have something to add to the conversation?
Hopefully. We use SSM a lot. We decided early on to adopt that. And while we don't have a lot of different Terraform stuff referring to different states, I'm actually in the middle of splitting some stuff up. But SSM has been really good. I've been able to write a whole bunch of tooling, you know, like tons of shell scripts where I'm just like, no, you guys don't have to know SSM. This script just interpolate to call that AWS SSM, you know, like stuff like that has made it really, really flexible and easy to use. Also, I've toyed with the idea of like info modules, and I haven't really put much time into it. But, you know, we have like 10 virtually identical client accounts, and they're identified by like client and environment. So, you know, in some places I've used data sources in non-root modules to get like VPC IDs or EKS cluster names and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But so, you know, that stuff is all basically work, but there are a couple things that I've been burned on that I just didn't want to share. And one of them was like, when you write your submodules, make everything a variable, because you're going to make everything a variable at some point. You know, like I'm finding that when, you know, I put data sources or whatever down in lower modules, I'm always ripping that stuff out. So, you know, your data sources, they use the tags or whatever at the root module, but just pass everything down, because you're gonna have, it just makes life easier, I have found. Yes, that's mainly it.
Oh, which is good. That just corroborates kind of some of the conclusions we had earlier about like child modules take pretty prescriptive variables like VPC IDs, and root modules can be more opinionated and use SSM. I also want to highlight the pattern that you brought up there with the info module, and you know, maybe one calls it metadata or who knows, but I think that's an interesting idea. It kind of goes in line with what Matt, I think, was maybe saying, that for your organization now, define how you do configuration, and maybe you have lots of different ways it can arrive in SSM, but then like if you're using Terraform, now you have your, you know, Acme config module, which can pull in all that information and surface it out in a consistent way. And that gives you the layer of abstraction. So if these things change, you can still keep the outputs in more or less the same way, even if they come from different places, which was, I think, like the concern Mohammed raised earlier, like paths can change.
Yeah.
All right. Who was that? Michael Jenkins?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I had a question for Eric for your child modules. How do you manage the versioning for them? Because that's one thing I run into, or one problem I run into with my team. We write modules that call other modules, and in the parent module, they reference the submodule as latest. But sometimes that's not always great, because the submodules will change and they could break the parent module. So I prefer to we use like the Git SHA for tagging, and I prefer to tag it to a specific SHA. But I was wondering how, you know, you, Eric, or other people are managing versioning for your child modules in your parent module.
Yeah.
Right. I've gone a couple different ways. And basically, I'm doing it in the root module. And it's pretty much a Terralith. It's like a mono repo with all my modules in there, because I have a couple, like there's a couple forked examples that I've had where I had to do, you know, like a life cycle thing that wasn't supported. So I had to hard code it. And it's been a lot easier to just have it all in one version of my Terralith, honestly. You know, I've actually ripped out some references and just put it in there, because I deploy to each of my sub environments from a state directory that basically just calls that module. So, you know, everything's right there, and it's actually a lot easier to manage, especially since, you know, you've got like 2-3 levels of modules, and it can make you insane You know,
Yeah.
when you have to go to another module. And then that hour you spend where you're like, shit, I didn't change the source to local. You know, like
Yeah.
a lot of stuff like that is eliminated.
Well, yeah, fortunately for us,
Yeah.
we also have a mono repo, you know, that where all the modules are in that one same bucket, you know,
Yeah.
bucket being the repo. So we could do like local versioning to say, hey, this module's been checked out, so it can, you know, you can dot directory up and then reference the module from there.
Mhm.
But we still use, because we use our modules from an S3 bucket, but the zip file in S3, whenever we like our CI process, it creates a, you know, version of the repo module called latest, and it creates one off the SHA of the version of the Git repo. So you can reference it either way. Latest is just easier because you just get it, you know,
Yeah, as long
without
as
having to modify your code. But yeah, I develop it with latest, and then
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you have some problems with the init and you know, locking and things like that.
Yeah.
With that, but I mean, totally overcomable. But
I think the pain of having to bump 3 versions of, you know, of downstream child modules is nothing compared to the pain of breaking your infrastructure because you didn't pin one of your modules to a specific version. And the version can be SHA, it can be actual tag, it can be whatever you want it to be, but like pinning it, if someone updates that and you don't realize it and you accidentally apply, you know, you can you know, literally like destroy infrastructure out there, and getting that back or getting data back or whatever it is could be, you know, could pale like that's tiny. The bumping of the versions multiple times is tiny compared to the damage you can do if you're not pinned. Plus you also can't have multiple versions of the component deployed to different places if you're not pinning. Like if you change the interface, you can't have like version 1 deployed here and version 2 deployed here while you're working things out. If it's all using latest, you end up screwing yourself.
same with the mono repo.
The mono repo can point back to itself though at a different SHA if you want to do that.
Right. I was thinking with local references.
Yeah, local references you can't, but if you point back to the mono repo at a different SHA, it can work. Right. But I would advocate for your root modules and your actual modules living in 2 different repositories. It will actually make your life much simpler over time, you know, for doing that. You know, that's a lesson learned from not having done that for a big part of my early Terraform days, and it was a pain in the ass to have a mono repo.
Yeah, lots of permissions issues there too. You know, it's a completely different set for, you know, the root modules and the config than it is for the code. Set of people, you know, that need to manage it or whatever.
Yeah, agreed.
So, Mohammed, before I start, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to wrap up about this data source debate. Somewhere I did it back in the days is creating a data source only module just one time. This module only like doing output and just query everything I need, and then use that across all the modules that I need to deploy. So that's actually make it easy just for one time only data source, I guess.
Okay, this is going back to the previous conversation we had though, just calling it out because I was a little confused there for a second. So bringing it back though in focus here on the pinning components to mono repo or not mono repo your infrastructure, at least, you know, whether you have your kind of root modules somewhere else and then your infrastructure repo that references some version of that. And I think there are 2 camps, 3 camps maybe. I would say the largest camp is probably in line with what Matt Calhoun just said, that you pin your modules you pin your root modules per environment like dev, staging, prod, what we call stage often. And then you can, rev and iterate within that environment as much as you need to without jeopardizing or risking destabilizing any of the other environments. And for optimizing for stability and not impacting other environments, I think that's a fair conclusion. That's how you would optimize it. The effects that I've seen, because we did practices at Cloud Posse for probably 3-4 years until about 2 years ago when we started moving away from it. And what happens is the onus to update the pinning in all of those environments is put onto your team. And then you need to make sure you have the tooling, therefore, to automate those updates. So, for example, you have your root modules in one repo. You have your VPC module in there. You have your dev environment pinned to version 1, or let's say make it say version 3. You have your staging environment pinned to version 2, and your production pinned to version 1. Now, what is your process for keeping all those environments up to date, knowing that you have updates to do? And one of the problems that I've seen with this is you're doing all this development in dev without real impact or understanding of what that's going to do down the road to staging and prod. Versus if you were doing smaller incremental changes that were getting pushed all the way through more regularly, you would avoid some of those mistakes. The issue is that you never see when you open that pull request, you never see the impact of that change in what is that change going to do to my dev or my staging or production environment. You only see usually what is going to happen to that dev environment. And before I bring up the the alternative to that, am I making sense so far? Any questions on what I'm describing? Because I know it's a little bit of hand waving.
No, I just wanted to follow up on what you're saying, Eric, because it totally makes sense. And I can give testimony on that in a module development that was done one way. It was rolled out into production environments. And then there was a decision to change a naming scheme in a module. Well, of course, if you change the name on Terraform, it's going to say, well, this thing is different now. I have to destroy it and recreate it. So then when you roll that module into your production environments, like Matt mentioned, you're actually going to start destroying stuff. It's going to go away. So fortunately, that was rolled back before it was pushed out. But exactly what you're saying, if you make some decisions in your development environment, they could have, dire impacts.
Huge impacts in production environments.
This is almost like it's almost like a continuous delivery debate right now.
Well, yeah. And it's kind of like you can't optimize for multiple variables at the same time. Yeah. So which one do you want to optimize for? Which one do you feel more comfortable with? So in the interest of time, I just
I was just gonna snarkily kind of say, if we only had feature flags in these modules, we could do it all the time.
I know. Amazon just needs to release feature flagging in all of their resources, so you can have as many EKS clusters as you want there. No, but so I want to give kind of the alternative way of doing this, that if you have been practicing the other way of pinning per environment, which has kind of been touted up in 1,000 Medium posts as the way you do it and where we came from, then this way will feel scary and almost like an anti-pattern until you understand maybe why it makes sense. So what we're doing, on the other hand, and here's an example of our Cloud Posse's internal infrastructure, is that we have all of our root modules here. They're in the mono repo. We used to have these in an external repo, but now we just keep it all together. And when we make a change to, for example, the VPC here and open a pull request, we will see the impact of that change across every environment that VPC is used. that comes down to our tooling and how we've implemented it, right? So we're using a tool called Spacelift. You could achieve similar things with Terraform Cloud, probably Scalar and M0. But for now, just limit it to Spacelift. All right, so the cool thing is now that we were able to see that before we merge into main, the impact of that change across all three environments. Now, let's say that it does have an impact that might change. And we decide knowingly that, okay, we're going to accept it. We're going to take it. We're going to merge that into main. Now, in some systems, that means it gets deployed to everything that's watching main, and then we'd update all three environments. But this is the separation of basically deploying from releasing. So when we merge into main, we're deploying that this change should go out. And then we want to control when it gets released to each environment. And most companies I see that do Terraform do not have the ability to really easily distinguish between those two stages. So that's why they practice this ability of version pinning, which is an actual physical code change in an environment to trigger that release to that environment. So in the change that in the model that we're presenting here, you can't depend on that because the code that production relies on was changed. You can't automatically deploy, so you have to be able to control when it gets released. All right. So if you go on.
Oh no, go ahead. Good.
So the last thing I want to say is, okay, so what about pinning? Because sometimes you don't have the leisure to let a small change roll out to all environments right away. Sometimes you need to work on something for an extended amount of time at an older version while you continue moving forward in staging and production. Well, the convention we've come up with is that I really like. I believe it's been proven or validated to work, is recognizing what you are doing when you are saying that. So the first thing you are doing is you're saying that we are going to diverge our environments deliberately for some amount of time. And that means that you're actually, you could say you're just pinning to do two different versions. Okay, but not really, because you are incurring debt at that point that you decide to do that. And that's why what we are doing when we need to do that is we create a copy of that component and we version it with our own convention. So you can say that we have EKS here. We can create EKS-2, EKS-3, EKS-4, whatever you want to use. And then the environment that needs to stay behind or wants to stay on the edge will pin to that version of what we call a component. These are all Terraform root modules that we call components. So what we achieve then is we still have pinning. We have the ability to deliberately diverge. We see that we've diverged. It's very clear that that's happening. And at this point, we want to converge again on the same version, and there's a pressure to do so.
Yeah, so what I did want to just clarify and make sure that no one was confused, what I was advocating for was within the root modules that we're pinning to two specific versions of the upstream module, okay, not just using latest, because that 100% that is a problem. So that's what I was that's specifically what I was talking about. And what you're saying also only works if you have a way to easily separate your you have tooling such as Atmos that allows you to easily deploy to different environments from the same base components without needing pinning and all of that kind of thing. So exactly. Yeah. So, but this, in here, if we use some sort of a module, you'll actually see that, we're pinning to a specific version of the cluster module. You don't want that to be latest, because that would actually mean that dev and prod could converge, even though you think you're deploying the same root component. And the the EKS cluster is a thing where I'm saying have it in a separate repo that you're pointing at, because we use our open source modules, but lots of companies use their own built modules that, and if that's in the same repository as your root components, it makes it more complex to pin to.
Okay, I
another
understand.
version of
I
it.
agree with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this is the constant debacle within Terraform. We're overloading the term module because it's both a root and a child. So Matt was really talking about child modules, and even if you're doing this locally, like for your organization, you 100% should be pinning and not using latest ever. Strongly agree with that statement. I was reacting to another pattern I've seen, which is how do you handle your root modules? And sometimes you have your infrastructure repo, and sometimes you have your root modules in yet another repo. And that's where it gets questionable. You'd still need tooling to pull those down because Terraform doesn't support the concept of remote root modules really. And then how are you pulling those down and having those version? That's what we've tried to avoid by keeping all the root modules in a mono repo, so they're always at the same commit kind of. All right, so that was a mouthful. We are out of time. We can always pick this up. Any I see you have a question. Hey, are you still there?
Yeah. Hi, good evening. Okay, so I just have a quick question, something I discovered on a mono repo. Okay, so I had something I worked on presently, and we currently use CICD, AWS development kit, and also I use code build and code pipeline to build my whole CICD and all of that. But while I was using, our front-end applications are built on mono repo. It's like a big repo that has a lot of how mono repo works. And I wasn't able to use code pipeline while building my CI/CD. So all I did was like tell code build to just check out, GitHub just checks out, and then code build builds my application and deploys to Kubernetes, because for some reason, I think GitHub has the amount of depth it can go through mono repo. I don't know if anyone has encountered that.
I think this is a good question, but I think it's a bigger conversation that I don't want to just brush over. Kind of patterns possibly for mono repo application development, which is a little bit different than the on the infrastructure side in my mind, because you have lots of artifacts usually with when you're deploying applications. So if you wouldn't mind, let's bring that one up next week, We'll add that to the agenda for talking points and get to that. So I'm going to wrap things up right now to respect everyone's busy schedules here. If you haven't already signed up for our YouTube channel, please head over to youtube.com/cloudposse. Again, youtube.com/cloudposse. You'll find today's recording there, as well as our back catalog of all the other episodes. So if you want to share a segment that you found really interesting with your team, that's how you do it. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Go to linkedin.com/in/Osterman. Again, that's linkedin.com/in/Osterman. Make sure you drop a note that you heard about us through sweetops or office hours. Otherwise, you get a lot of spam connection requests as well. If you want to get an invitation for our weekly office hours, so you don't forget, go to cloudposse.com/office hours, fill out your email, and you'll get a weekly reminder as well as a calendar invitation to our event. As always, thanks everyone for your time. Great conversation today, and have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.